She was 23 years old, broke in the way that goes all the way to the bone, and standing on a sidewalk in a town she had never intended to stop in, watching a bus disappear around a bend in the road without her. She had $18, a leather tool roll that had been her father's, a duffel bag of clothes that needed washing, and nowhere in the world that belonged to her.
It looks beautiful, doesn't it?
That is where this story begins. Not with the vault,
They did such a
not
wonderful
with the
job
letters,
with the tiles.
not with the deed that a man had filed with a county recorder 116 years ago in language so precisely written that it was still holding its meaning on the morning Eliza Marsh arrived in Kellerton, Iowa, with her $18 and her dead father's tools. The vault and the letters and the deed matter enormously, and we will get to all of them. But none of them is the beginning. The beginning is a girl on a sidewalk looking across a street at a building with boards over its windows and a rusted flagpole and a stone lintel with weathered letters carved into it that said U.S. Post Office, and feeling something she did not have a word for yet. Before we go back to that morning, though, we have to go forward, not far, far enough to see where it ends, so you understand from the first moment why it matters how it started. It is a Saturday in October, 14 months after Eliza Marsh stepped off a broken-down bus in Kellerton, Iowa. She is standing just inside the front door of what was once the Kellerton Post Office, and the room around her is full of people. They came from the county, some from further. A woman in her mid-70s stands in the far corner with a birthday card held against her chest, eyes closed, not crying exactly, doing something that contains crying and goes beyond it. A man in his 80s at the service counter runs his thumb along the polished wood with the slow deliberateness of reading. A child, perhaps 7, has pressed her face against the glass of one of the brass mailbox windows and is looking in with the concentrated wonder of someone who has just discovered that small spaces can contain whole worlds. The floor is original tile, black and white octagons, hand set in 1908 polish through 6 weeks of patient work to a surface that catches light like still water. The ceiling is pressed tin, painted the color of old cream, with a single brass fixture at the center, throwing warmth down into the room. Along the left wall, the original post office boxes run in 2 rows, every one in place, every glass window intact, some of them still holding letters that will never be claimed. Eliza's phone shows 428 unread emails. She will answer them. She always does. She looks at the room and the people in it, and she thinks about her father, and she thinks about her mother, and she thinks about an old woman sitting in a chair by a window 40 miles away, holding a photograph of this room in both hands, who had said to her, "I left the door unlocked because I knew the right person wouldn't need a combination. They would only need to want it enough to push." There is a developer who showed up within hours of her signing the papers, smiling too carefully and offering too much money for a building worth very little. There is a wall that had been secretly sealed sometime in the 1940s, and what was found behind it when Reed Galloway took it apart brick by brick. There is a geological survey hidden in the vault by someone who had understood before Eliza arrived what the land beneath the building was worth, and there are the letters in the canvas sacks, hundreds of them, and what happened when they finally reached the people they had been sent to 40 years before. But to understand any of it, we have to go to the beginning, not to the bus or the $18, further back, to the man who built the building with his own hands and 11 of his neighbors, and the specific stubborn love of a person who has decided that something matters and will not be moved from that position, to a man named Ezekiel Whitfield and a flat piece of ground in Iowa in 1903, and the kind of decision that echoes for a century. Ezekiel Whitfield had been a postal clerk in Indiana for 8 years when he came west. He was 31 with a wife named Ruth and 3 children and a particular vision of what a life could look like if you owned the ground under your feet instead of renting it, and he had saved methodically toward that vision for nearly a decade, sorting other people's correspondence and thinking about land. He was not a large man. The photographs that survived him show someone medium built and weathered, wearing a hat that belonged on a preacher, with eyes that had the look of eyes that spend a great deal of time considering things from multiple angles before arriving at a position. He homesteaded 80 acres outside of Kellerton in 1903 and spent 2 years learning what Iowa winters actually were, which was different from what Indiana winters were, and both of them different from anything a reasonable person would choose. Ruth Whitfield did not complain. She had married a man who sorted mail and dreamed about land, and when the land arrived, she accepted its terms with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. In 1906, the postmaster of Kellerton died of a heart attack behind the counter of the dry goods store where the postal operation occupied a corner. The regional office needed someone with experience. Ezekiel had experience. He also had a letter he sent to the regional supervisor within the week, written in formal and unhurried language, that said a post office is not a corner of a dry goods store. It is the place where a community connects to everything beyond what its members can see from their own front porches, and it deserves to be housed in a building that reflects that purpose. The regional supervisor did not respond to this letter. Ezekiel built the building himself. It took 2 years. 11 men from the farms and homesteads surrounding Kellerton came to work on their off days and their Saturdays, and sometimes after church on Sundays, not for wages beyond their meals, but because Ezekiel had explained what he was building, and they understood that it was theirs as much as his. The brick came from a kiln in Burlington by wagon. The floor tiles were ordered from Chicago, small black and white octagons of hard-fired clay, each one requiring careful individual placement to achieve the pattern Ezekiel had sketched on a seed catalog. His eldest son, 14 years old and comfortable with heights, hammered the pressed tin ceiling panels into place with the focus of someone doing work that will outlast him by generations. The brass fixtures were purchased with Ezekiel's own savings, not from the postal appropriation, because Ezekiel believed that certain things were worth paying for yourself if you wanted them done the way they deserved to be done. The building opened on April 14, 1908. When the last piece was in place and the crew had gone home and the building sat finished and quiet in the spring afternoon, Ezekiel stood alone in the lobby and looked at the tile floor and the tin ceiling and the rows of brass boxes and the service counter with its ornate grill, and then he turned to Ruth, who had brought sandwiches for the crew and stayed to watch the last hours, and he said, "This building is not mine. I built it, but it belongs to Kellerton." He meant it in the most literal possible sense. The deed he filed with the county recorder the following Tuesday conveyed the building and all the land beneath it, and the 3 adjacent lots on Main Street, to the community of Kellerton, Iowa, in perpetuity for public and civic purposes, not to the Postal Service, not to the federal government, to the community, and in a clause at the bottom of that deed drafted by Ezekiel's attorney with a precision that would not be fully appreciated for 116 years, the provision that all mineral rights below the parcel to a depth of 1,000 feet were included in the conveyance and could not be separated from the surface rights under any future transaction or circumstance. Ezekiel Whitfield understood that land could conceal things below its surface that the person who first broke it had no way of knowing were there. He wanted those things, whatever they turned out to be, to belong to the community that lived above them. He died in 1941, having run the post office for 33 years. His son Howard took over the same year. Howard was a quieter man than his father, more interior, but no less committed to the building's purpose. He sorted mail twice on slow days during the Depression because sorting gave people something orderly to watch in a period when orderly things were rare. He paid for other people's postage 37 times between 1931 and 1934, recording each instance in his ledger without emphasis as if it were simply part of the job. He walked up farmhouse lanes during the Second World War with government envelopes whose weight he had learned to read before he reached the door, and he knocked on those doors and delivered what he was carrying because the job did not allow him to choose only the easy parts. Agnes Whitfield took over from Howard in 1964. She was 36 years old and had been working beside her father since she was old enough to reach the sorting shelves without assistance. She did not need to be trained. She had been absorbing the job for 20 years through daily observation of a person who took it seriously, and she had arrived at her own understanding of what it was for. Agnes was precise and direct and possessed of a way of looking at people over her reading glasses that said she had heard what they were saying and had formed a view on it, and they could decide for themselves whether they wanted to know what the view was. She knew every family in Kellerton by their envelopes. She knew which marriages were in trouble from the lawyer's letters. She knew which children had left for good from the forwarding address cards they filed, and which ones hadn't filed them but had left anyway. She knew which old men were lonely from the letters they sent to people who only wrote back at holidays, and she held that knowledge with the discretion of someone who understood that knowing things is a responsibility. She ran the Kellerton Post Office for 23 years, and she was good at it in the way that certain people are good at their work, not because they have exceptional talent, but because they have decided without drama and without requiring acknowledgement that the work deserves the best they can give it every day. In June of 1987, the Regional Postal Service sent her a form letter informing her that the Kellerton office would be consolidated with the facility in Mount Pleasant, effective the 30th of that month. She was given 12 weeks' notice. The letter was signed by an administrator she had never met. She spent those 12 weeks going through the vault. The undeliverable letters had accumulated over decades, letters with wrong addresses, letters to people who had moved without leaving a forwarding address, letters that had come back from routes that no longer existed. She had kept them all in canvas sacks in the vault, believing that the community they had come from deserved to keep them rather than lose them to a dead letter facility in Kansas City where no one would know any of the names on the envelopes. The money orders were from grandparents who had sent birthday money to grandchildren who had relocated. The cash was from holiday cards sent to addresses the Postal Service no longer served. The small objects in the third strong box, a wristwatch, and a silver compact and 2 rings had arrived without return addresses or from origins that could not be traced back. She put everything back. She wrote a letter. She set the letter on top of the ledgers on the right shelf of the vault. She left the vault door unlocked. She turned off the lights in the back room and walked through the lobby one final time, past the brass boxes and the tile floor and the tin ceiling, and she went out through the weathered green door and did not look back. That was June of 1987. The building stood empty for 37 years. The deed Ezekiel Whitfield had filed with the county recorder sat in a folder in the county archive patient as stone. Thomas Marsh grew up in Omaha, in a neighborhood where the fathers worked with their hands and the mothers worked just as hard, and the summers were long and the winters did not apologize for themselves. His own father had worked at a manufacturing plant for 30 years, coming home tired and quiet every evening and reading the newspaper at the kitchen table and never once suggesting that there was anything remarkable about a life built from consistent daily work. Thomas had absorbed this without being told to. He had arrived at it through watching, which is how the most durable lessons are learned. He enlisted in the army at 19. He had a mechanical aptitude that was obvious to anyone who saw him take apart an engine and put it back together faster and more cleanly than he had found it, and the army used this ability, efficiently training him as a vehicle mechanic and deploying that training in loud, hot places that were nothing like Nebraska. He developed in those years the quality of attention that separates a good mechanic from a great one. He learned to hear not just what a machine was doing, but what it was in the process of becoming, the preliminary sounds that preceded failure, the small deviations in rhythm that announced themselves long before they became visible problems. He listened to engines the way musicians listen to music, not as a collection of sounds, but as structured information that rewarded close reading. He served in the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991. When people asked him about it later, he talked about the desert, about the quality of the light over flat ground, and the way the stars at night pressed down in a sky so clear it felt almost intrusive. He did not talk about the other things. He brought a cough home from the Gulf that settled into his chest and stayed. The doctors named it eventually Gulf War Syndrome, which was the medical community's way of acknowledging that something had happened to men who served in that campaign that was doing things to their bodies that no one fully understood. The cough became worse over years. Other things followed the cough. Thomas kept working because work was what he knew and because stopping felt like something he was not willing to consider. He met Nora Calloway in 1994 at the garage where he worked. She brought in a car with a radiator problem and stood at the counter with the expression of someone who has been told it will take longer and cost more than expected enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. Thomas told her it would be done by Thursday. He had it done Wednesday afternoon. She came back Saturday and asked if he wanted to get coffee. They married in 1996. They moved into a rented duplex on the west side of Omaha, yellow-sided, faded to a color that was neither quite what it had started as nor anything else definite. Nora worked emergency room nursing on 12-hour shifts and came home exhausted and still made dinner and still sat on the front steps in the evenings to watch the sun go down behind the roof lines across the street, which she said was the day's best part because the light did something in that last half hour that it did not do at any other time. Eliza was born in 2001. Thomas began bringing her to the garage on Saturdays when she was 4, sitting her on a stool in a corner, clear of anything that moved. By 6, she was handing him tools. By 8, she understood what each tool was for and passed the right one without being asked. By 10, she was changing oil on sedans by herself correctly, because correctly was the standard Thomas had given her, and she had accepted it without question. He taught her to listen. He would hold her beside a running motor, his hand on her shoulder, and tell her to close her eyes and stop thinking and just hear, not to analyze, not to categorize, just to receive what the engine was saying without filtering it through expectation. Over years and hundreds of sessions in the garage on Kellerton Avenue, she developed the ability he had spent his own years developing. She heard what the engine was doing. She heard what it was about to do. She understood that this ability, learned against the background noise of a garage in Omaha, was not really about engines at all. It was about paying attention with all of yourself to something that mattered and trusting what you heard. Thomas died when Eliza was 14. His body gave out the way bodies give out when they have been given reasons to give out and have been patient about it for a long time. The cough became what the cough had always been in the process of becoming. His strength went by degrees, the way good light goes at the end of a long afternoon, steadily, until suddenly he died at home in his own bed in the spring, with Nora beside him and Eliza at the foot of the bed, and the last thing he said to his daughter was between the two of them and belongs to them alone. After Thomas died, Eliza worked. She worked at the garage where Thomas had been lead mechanic under Bert Callister, who had been Thomas's closest friend since before Eliza could remember. Bert was 62 at the time of this story, built from decades of physical labor with a face that the years had organized around the primary business of being straightforward, and he expressed his care for Thomas's daughter in the way he expressed everything through consistent practical action taken without comment. He gave her as much work as she could carry and taught her what Thomas had not had time to teach. He taught her welding, the patience of it, the reading of metal through the light of an arc. He taught her diagnostics on computerized systems, which Thomas had regarded with mild suspicion, and Bert had embraced early understanding that computers were just another system that rewarded the same quality of attention as everything else. Eliza worked and learned and did not speak much about the fact of working at 16 instead of the things 16-year-olds were supposed to be doing, because Thomas had not been a man who complained about the terms life presented, and she had decided to be her father's daughter in this as in other things. By 17, she was the second most capable mechanic in the garage. On certain specific jobs, she was the most capable. She did not point this out. The work pointed it out. Nora watched all of this with a love that contained alongside its admiration a private worry she did not voice, because voicing it would have required suggesting that Eliza slow down, and there was nothing in the girl that would slow down, nothing that wanted to. And the worry was, perhaps Nora thought sometimes on the front steps in the evenings more about herself than about her daughter. She kept making dinner after 12-hour shifts. She kept sitting on the front steps. She kept watching the light do its thing at the end of the day. Then she started coughing. It began in October when Eliza was 22. Low-grade, persistent, easy to explain. Nora explained it to herself through the changing weather and the dry air in the ER and the viral season that came through every year and was nothing to get worked up about. She was a nurse of 20 years. She knew at some level below the explanations what a cough that did not resolve in 3 weeks could mean. She chose not to know it for several months with the specific determination of someone whose life does not have room for what the knowing would require. In January, she saw a specialist. The cancer was in both lungs and had reached her lymph nodes. Stage 4. The oncologist was careful with his language, which was how Nora knew before he finished his first sentence that the language was covering something he did not want to land all at once. She drove home, she made dinner, she sat on the front steps in the cold January dark and looked at the empty sky where the sun had been, and thought about her daughter, and thought about Thomas, and thought about the particular unfairness of a nurse who had never smoked in her life, which she recognized as its own kind of self-pity and set aside. When Eliza came home and sat beside her on the steps, Nora said, "I want you to know I've been very lucky. Whatever happens, I need you to know I understood that." Eliza dropped out of school and moved back into the duplex. 4 months. She learned the healthcare system from the inside as a combatant, and what she learned was this: the system was not designed to help the people who needed it most. It was designed around assumptions that broke down exactly where patients were most vulnerable, and navigating it required either wealth or time, or an absolute refusal to be worn down by the process of its dysfunction. She had no wealth and no time, and the refusal she had developed over a decade of watching her father not complain about his circumstances. She kept records. She called back when she was told to call back, and she called back when she was told to wait, and she called back when the person she needed was in a meeting and left a message, and then called again when the message was not returned. She appealed denials in writing and followed up on the appeals. She argued with billing departments calmly and with documentation, and she did not stop arguing until she had obtained the adjustment she had documented was correct. Nora died on a Tuesday morning in late March, 3 weeks before Eliza's 23rd birthday. Eliza was holding her hand. The hospice nurse said it was as peaceful as these things ever are, which was a sentence Eliza turned over in her mind for weeks afterward without arriving at a settled relationship to it. After the funeral, Eliza was alone in the duplex for the first time in her life. The rent was paid through the end of the month, the medical bills reduced by insurance and hardship arrangements, and Eliza's months of fighting were still a number that exceeded what she had. The collection calls began before the month ended. She sold the car. She sold the furniture piece by piece to people who came to the duplex and assessed its worth with the detached efficiency of buyers rather than the grief of inheritors. She sold Nora's wedding ring at a pawn shop for $180, which was less than it was worth, and she knew it was less, and she could not do better without paperwork she did not have. She sold her engineering textbooks to a used bookstore for $22 total. The cashier did not look up. On the 1st of May, she left the duplex with a backpack, a duffel bag of clothes, and the leather tool roll with Thomas's 6 tools in it, a combination wrench, 2 screwdrivers, a ratchet with a 1/4-inch drive, a set of feeler gauges, and a small pry bar wrapped in electrical tape at the handle where the original grip had worn away. She had $91 in her bank account. Bert Callister had told her twice there was a job at the garage whenever she wanted it. She was not ready for Omaha. Omaha was full of places she would have to walk past, and she was not ready for walking past. She caught a bus heading east and watched the city become fields and let her mind go to the place it went when it had been working too hard, which was a place without thoughts, just the flat Iowa landscape repeating outside the window, and the particular blankness of a person who has been under pressure for so long that the absence of pressure feels like a new kind of pressure. She had $73 when she boarded. She had $18 when the bus broke down. The driver said they'd be moving in 45 minutes. It turned into 2 hours. Eliza walked the 1/4 mile to the town's main street and went into the only diner she could see to use the bathroom. And when she came back out, the bus was already pulling away, and she stood on the sidewalk and watched it go and did not run after it. Later, she would not be able to say with certainty whether she had missed the bus on purpose. She would decide eventually that it did not matter, that some things happen in a way that makes the question of purpose irrelevant. The woman behind the diner counter had a gray braid to her shoulder blades and a name tag that said Vera Sims, and the manner of someone who could read what people needed before they sat down. She set a cup of coffee in front of Eliza without asking, and then a piece of pie that Eliza had not ordered. Eliza said she hadn't ordered pie. Vera said she was aware of that. Eliza ate the pie. Through the diner window across the street and slightly back from the sidewalk was a small red brick building. Its windows were boarded with plywood that had weathered gray. A rusted flagpole stood beside the door without a flag. Ivy had grown up the right side of the facade and was making progress across the top. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the front steps. The door was weathered green. Above the door, a stone lintel with carved letters, some of them worn to suggestions, but she could make them out. U.S. Post Office. She looked at it the way you look at something that is trying to reach you in a frequency you do not quite speak yet. She asked Vera about it. Vera leaned against the counter and told her closed in 1987 when the Postal Service consolidated routes, been empty since government tried to sell it for years without success. Last she heard they were listing it for $1 to get it off the county's books. 2 people had tried to claim it since the dollar sale program began. Neither one had lasted more than a few months. The county office was 3 blocks down on the corner. Charlotte Briggs handled the property side of things. Eliza looked at the building. She had $18. She thought about what it meant to own something outright. No lease, no landlord, no envelope arriving to tell her the terms had changed. She thought about what it would feel like to stand inside a building and know that it was hers, even if it was broken, even if it was in a town she had never heard of, even if the town itself was clearly having a long, difficult conversation with the question of its own survival. Owning something meant having a place to stand, not borrowed ground, not rented ground, ground she could defend. She left $17 on the counter and walked 3 blocks down Main Street. Charlotte Briggs had the file already open on her screen. She was 55 with reading glasses on a chain and the unhurried patience of someone who has spent decades turning complicated information into language that helps people make decisions. She had received Vera's call 7 minutes before Eliza walked in, and she had decided that what this situation deserved was her full preparation. She explained it plainly. The building had been surplus federal property since 1987. The county had held it since 2009 after 14 years of failed auction attempts. Since 2010, it had been available to any qualifying applicant for $1 with 2 conditions: assume the property taxes and bring the structure up to applicable building codes within 18 months. Miss the deadline, the property reverts to the county. 2 prior attempts, Charlotte said. The first in 2004, a woman who gave up after 3 months when she learned what the foundation repair would cost. The second in 2011, a man named Dennis Kolb. He lasted 6 weeks, checked out of the motel one morning without telling anyone, left his belongings in the room, drove away. His file said personal reasons. Nobody had seen him since. Eliza looked at the space in the file where Dennis Kolb's reasons should have been explained and weren't. I'd like to claim the building, she said. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the tool roll on the bench beside Eliza, and at the duffel bag, and at the look in Eliza's face, which was not the look of someone who did not understand what she was taking on, but the look of someone who understood and had decided anyway. She pulled out the form. 40 minutes later, Charlotte handed her a large brass key on a wooden tag that said Kellerton P.O. in ballpoint pen. The key was heavier than it looked. It had the weight of something that had been used every working day for 8 decades and then not used at all for 37 years. Good luck, Charlotte said with the complete seriousness of meaning it. Eliza walked back up Main Street and stood on the cracked concrete in front of the building and looked at it straight on for the first time. 30 feet wide, maybe 50 deep, 1 story solid in the way of buildings built before, disposability became an assumption. The brick was old enough to have the color variation that fire kiln work produces. No 2 bricks exactly the same shade. The mortar joints were tight, the original work still holding. She put the key in the lock. Stiff, but it turned. She heard a voice behind her. A man on the sidewalk 10 feet back, well dressed in a way that was intentional rather than habitual, the jacket cut by someone who charged for cutting. 45 years old perhaps, with a face that had organized itself over the years around the work of being convincing, the features pleasant and carefully arranged and watchful behind the pleasantness. He was smiling with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that smiles were a form of currency. Craig Holloway, he said. He kept his hands in his pockets. He told her he had been monitoring this property for 2 years, that he had come very close to an arrangement with the county on the adjacent lots on 2 separate occasions, that he had noticed a new claim was filed that morning. The way he said notice suggested it had not been casual. He offered her $40,000 for the claim she had signed an hour ago. He said it the way men offer considerably more than fair market value, as if the generosity itself was the argument. No, Eliza said. He held the smile. I understand. Take your time with it. I'm not going anywhere. He paused for emphasis. I'm a patient man. He walked back to a car parked half a block down, got in without hurrying, and drove south on Main Street. Eliza watched him go. She thought about the word patient and the work it was doing in that sentence. She turned back to the door. She pushed it open. The smell came first, old paper and old wood, and underneath those something that was specific to this building and no other, the accumulated chemical memory of decades of federal routine rubber stamps and carbon paper and the particular floor wax that government buildings had used for years and that nobody made anymore. All of it faint, ghostly, but present. The molecular residue of what the building had been for 80 years. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The lobby was smaller than it had looked from the street, but what it surrendered in size, it gave back in quality. The ceiling was higher than the exterior suggested, pressed tin panels intact across their full span. The paint faded, but the surface unbroken. The brass fixture at the center was dark, the power long disconnected, but afternoon light came through the gaps in the window, boarding in long, specific bars that made the suspended dust glow, and the room looked like something held in time. The brass mailboxes ran the full length of the left wall. 2 rows, 212 boxes each, numbered each with its small glass window. Most windows showed empty compartments. Some held envelopes, letters that had arrived after the last day the boxes were checked and had never been retrieved, sitting in the dark for 37 years in the patient way of things that have nowhere else to be. The service counter along the right side of the room was polished wood, the depth of the polish visible even under the years of neglect. Above it, the brass grill, ornate and tarnished, but structurally whole, and on the wall behind the counter, hanging at a slight angle that it had perhaps acquired sometime in the preceding decades, a framed photograph of Ronald Reagan in his official portrait, smiling outward at a room that had been empty for the majority of the years that photograph had been hanging there. She went through the gate in the grill into the working space behind the counter, sorting tables with pigeonhole cubbies, a few of the cubbies still holding paperwork from 1987, a metal desk with an adding machine from an era before everything was digital, a rack of pegs for mail carriers' bags, some still holding canvas straps left behind, and on the small table that customers would have used to fill out forms of pencil, set down on the last day and not picked up again. At the far end of the back room, built into the wall, as if the wall had grown up around it, a steel door, dark green paint over heavy gauge, steel gold lettering, U.S. government property, postal inspector, keep secure, a combination dial, a brass handle gone dark with decades of oxidation. She crossed to it. She put her hand on the handle and turned it. It moved freely. The door was not locked. It swung open on its hinges with a slow, resonant groan, the sound of something that had been sealed for a very long time, releasing its seal. She found the small flashlight she carried in her jacket pocket, habit from years of working in the dark spaces under vehicles, and she turned it on and let the beam travel the interior of the vault. Steel shelves on both walls and across the back. On the right, leather-bound ledgers in careful order by year, going back to the early 1940s. 50 years of daily postal business recorded in the handwriting of each successive clerk who worked behind that counter. On the left, 3 strong boxes, metal with handles and padlocks. Each padlock rusted to a uniform orange-brown. Each strongbox sitting squarely on its shelf with the self-possession of objects that have not been moved in decades. On the back shelf between ledgers and strongboxes, 3 canvas mail sacks, heavy canvas leather drawstrings, brass tags stamped USPS property, all 3 full, bulging with the weight of their contents, and on top of the rightmost stack of ledgers, a white envelope gone slightly yellow, at the edges addressed in careful fountain pen script, "To whoever finds this, please open." She did not open it yet. She left the vault door open and went to the metal desk and found a hammer in the bottom drawer, solid and balanced, the kind of hammer made before tools became disposable. She went back to the first strong box and broke the padlock off with 3 strokes and lifted the lid. Money orders. dozens of them grouped in stacks, the rubber bands holding each group long since dried to nothing. Postal money orders each in a different hand, each made out to a named recipient for a specific sum. She read the dates: 1983, 1981, 1985, 1979, 1986. The amounts range from $10 to $120. None had been cashed. The second strongbox. More money orders and beneath them cash. Paper bills in bundled stacks. The paper softened from years of handling. Before it was put away, real money, more than she had expected. She counted it on the sorting table. $16,400. The third strongbox. More bills, and in a small felt pouch set to one side, 3 objects: a man's wristwatch, a silver compact with engraved initials on the back, and 2 rings, a plain gold band and a diamond engagement ring in a setting that belonged to the 1940s or early 1950s. She reached to the bottom of the third strongbox before setting it down. Her fingers found something under the felt pouch. She lifted it out, a padlock, already broken. The hasp had been cut cleanly with a blade rather than broken with a hammer, and the padlock had been put back in the box afterward, tucked beneath the pouch, position to be found only by someone who reached all the way to the bottom. Someone had been inside this strong box before her. She set the broken padlock on the sorting table and looked at it. Then she went back to the vault and stood in front of the lower right shelf, the one she had not yet examined. She crouched and shone the flashlight into the back of the shelf. It appeared empty. She ran her hand along the shelf surface past the front edge to the back, and her fingers found the corner of something flat and stiff that had been pushed as far back as it would go, hard against the rear wall behind the original shelf lining. She worked it free carefully, a cardboard sleeve taped shut with tape that had gone brittle. The adhesive long since failed at the edges, so that the tape came away without resistance. On the outside of the sleeve, in a handwriting she did not recognize, 3 words written in pencil: "Do not open." She put it on the sorting table with everything else. She went back to the mail sacks and carried the first one out. Both hands, it was heavier than she expected, and set it on the table and loosened the leather drawstring. Letters, hundreds of them loosely sorted by size, yellowed but intact. The addresses faded but legible. She pulled out a handful and read the postmarks: 1981, 1977, 1984, 1979, 1983. Letters written in one decade and the decade before by people who had trusted the Kellerton post office to carry them, sitting here in the dark for 30 to 40 years. She put everything back carefully and went to the envelope on the shelf and sat down on the edge of the sorting table and opened it. The letter was 3 pages of government stationery, written on the front and back of each sheet in a handwriting that was precise and deliberate, the product of someone who had been writing important things for a long time and understood that care in writing was itself a form of respect for the reader. My name is Agnes Whitfield. I was the postmaster of Kellerton, Iowa from 1964 until this office closed in June of 1987. Today is my last day. She wrote about the building. She wrote about her grandfather Ezekiel, who had built it and had understood from the beginning that it was not his, but the community's. She wrote about her father Howard and the things he had done during the Depression and the war that she had not fully appreciated until she was old enough to understand what they cost him. She wrote about her own 23 years, not with sentimentality, but with the specific earned respect of someone accounting for what they gave to something they believed in. Then she wrote about what she had left in the vault and why and what she asked. These letters were meant for people in this community or written by people in this community, and they belong here. They do not belong in a warehouse where no one who handles them will know any of the names. Try to find the people they were sent to. Some cannot be found. Those you cannot find, keep what they contain for yourself. You have earned it by being the person who came here and cared enough to open this vault. Whatever you do with this building, please remember what it was. People came here to send their love to one another across distances that felt impossible, and sometimes the love got lost on the way. Try to do right by the lost love if you can. She signed it. Agnes Whitfield, June 30th, 1987. Eliza read it twice slowly. Then she folded it along its original creases and pressed it against her chest with both hands and sat down on the cold tile floor of the back room and cried. She had not cried at Thomas's funeral because she had been 14 and had not yet understood that she was allowed to. She had not cried at Nora's because the 4 months preceding it had left her with a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than tears. But here in the back room of an abandoned post office in a town she had never planned to stop in, holding a letter written 37 years ago by a woman she had never met, she cried for everything she had been carrying and had not put down. She cried for Thomas, who had listened to engines the way other people listen to music, and who had carried a desert and a cough home from the Gulf and had spent 15 years giving her everything he knew. She cried for Nora, who had made dinner after 12-hour shifts and watched sunsets from front steps and had died in late March with her daughter's hand in hers. She cried for the 4 months of fighting insurance companies and billing departments, and for the ring she had sold for $180, and for the $22 she had gotten for textbooks she had studied late into nights. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She straightened her jacket. She put Agnes's letter in the inside pocket of her jacket close to her chest. Then she picked up the cardboard sleeve with the penciled warning and peeled back the tape and opened it. Inside were 12 pages stapled at the corner. The cover page bearing the logo of a company called Western Range Geosciences, followed by the title Subsurface Assessment Survey, and a county and parcel description that she read twice. At the bottom of the cover page, a date, March 2009. She sat down at the sorting table and read it from cover to cover. Western Range Geosciences had conducted a subsurface assessment of 12 square miles of Kellerton County, Iowa, including the post office parcel and the 3 adjacent lots on Main Street. In technical language that cleared in the sections written for non-specialist readers, the report described the discovery of a significant recoverable deposit of high-grade industrial silica, the kind used in semiconductor manufacturing and as a proppant in hydraulic fracturing, located directly beneath the post office parcel and extending into the surrounding lots. The preliminary commercial value estimate, expressed in the conservative language of professional caution, still described a number that Eliza read 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. Someone had put this survey in the vault in 2009, someone who had access to the building after it closed and before anyone claimed it, someone who needed the information to stay available but not findable by the wrong person. She set the survey down. She looked at the broken padlock. She thought about Dennis Kolb, who had claimed this building in 2011 and vanished 6 weeks later, and whose file said only personal reasons. Charlotte Briggs had photographed the documents from Kolb's file for Eliza on the day she signed the papers, and Eliza had saved the photos. She found the emergency contact number now and dialed it. It rang 6 times. A man answered, cautious, in the specific way of someone who has learned through direct experience to be cautious about unexpected calls. She told him her name and where she was calling from. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "I've been waiting for this call," he said, or something like it. His name was Dennis Kolb, and he was living in Davenport now. He had claimed the Kellerton building in March of 2011 and had been there for 6 weeks working on the initial assessment of the renovation needs when he had opened the 3rd strongbox and found the survey beneath the padlock he had cut to get in. He had read it. He had understood, having spent years in commercial real estate, what the numbers in it meant for the land. The next morning, he received a phone call. A man who would not give his name told him that his presence in Kellerton had been noted, that the situation with the post office property was complicated in ways that he might not be aware of, and that he should consider whether his involvement was worth the complication. Then the man asked Dennis if he had a family. Dennis had a wife and 2 daughters, both in school. He had driven out of Kellerton that afternoon and had not gone back. "I'm not proud of it," he said. Eliza said nothing about pride. "The man who called you," she said. "Do you know who it was?" "I didn't know then. I've had 11 years to look at county planning records, which are public. There's a name on every proposal touching that part of Main Street for the past 8 years. Holloway Land Partners." She thanked him. He told her to be careful, in the tone of someone who had not taken his own advice and was still paying some version of the cost. She ended the call and stood for a moment in the back room with the survey and the broken padlock and the canvas sacks against the wall and Agnes Whitfield's letter against her chest. Craig Holloway had been watching this property for 2 years before she arrived. He had known about the survey because someone on his side had placed it here for safekeeping after reviewing the county archive. He had been waiting for the county to reclaim the property from whichever claimant was currently failing, and he had been applying whatever pressure was necessary to accelerate that failure. She thought about her father and the lessons about listening, about understanding a problem completely before you tried to fix it, about the patience required to work on a broken thing the right way. She picked up her notebook and went to find Charlotte Briggs. Charlotte came to the building the following morning with a folder from the county archive. She had been reviewing the historical documents on the post office parcel since Eliza had asked her to, and she had found something that she spread on the sorting table with the care of someone presenting evidence that changes the shape of a situation. A photocopy of a deed from 1908, Ezekiel Whitfield's handwriting, the same hand Eliza had seen in photographs of Kellerton's founding documents. The deed conveyed the building and the land beneath it and the 3 adjacent lots on Main Street to the community of Kellerton, Iowa, in perpetuity for civic and public purposes, not to the Postal Service, not to the federal government, to the community. And at the bottom, the mineral rights clause, all subsurface rights to 1,000 feet, included in the conveyance and inseparable from it. This deed, Charlotte said quietly, was never superseded. The GSA's classification of this building as surplus federal property was made in error. They reviewed the operational history, not the underlying title. The underlying title is this document. She set down a second document, County Letterhead, 1962, signed by 4 members of the Kellerton Town Council, a resolution confirming the 1908 conveyance and adding the provision that any future mineral or subsurface resource discovered beneath the parcel would produce revenues administered by the community in perpetuity. Holloway's side found both of these in the archive, Charlotte said. That's why the survey went into the vault in 2009. They needed to keep the information controlled while they worked on a strategy to get around the community deed, and the strategy was to ensure no independent claimant ever successfully held the building long enough to discover what was underneath it, and then work a deal with the county directly and argue the community deed had lapsed. Had it lapsed? Charlotte looked at the 1962 resolution's language, which was self-renewing and unambiguous. No, she said, not remotely. They called Patricia Howe in Burlington that afternoon, a property lawyer Charlotte knew who had spent 20 years in title disputes and who listened to everything with the focused attention of someone accustomed to situations where the facts properly understood change everything. Patricia asked for copies of all documents. She said she would call within 2 weeks. She called in 11 days. The 1908 deed was valid and operative. she said, and had never been legally superseded. The GSA classification was in error and correctable. The mineral rights clause was enforceable. The 1962 Town Council resolution was valid and self-renewing. The community of Kellerton, Iowa, held clear title to the parcel and to all mineral rights beneath it. Craig Holloway had no legal claim to any part of this property. He knew this, Patricia said. Whoever advised him read that 1908 deed and understood what the mineral rights clause meant. The survey was placed in the vault in 2009, after that reading, specifically to keep the information out of circulation. The strategy required the building to remain unclaimed or to be claimed by someone who would fail to complete the renovation within the 18-month window, which would return the property to the county, at which point they planned to approach the county commissioners with a proposal that would sidestep the community deed by arguing it had not been maintained in active use. There was silence on Eliza's end of the call while she absorbed this. He misjudged the deed's durability, Patricia continued, and he misjudged the difficulty of keeping the building unclaimed indefinitely. He needed someone patient enough to read the original documents carefully and smart enough to understand what they said. And now he has it. In the meantime, Reed Galloway had come to the building. He appeared on a Friday morning 4 days after Eliza moved into the back room, which she had done without informing the county because the occupancy issue would resolve itself and she needed a place to sleep. Reed was 24, lean, with hands that had been doing construction since his teens, and he arrived with the practical directness of someone who had been told about the situation by Vera Sims and had decided that deciding not to help would have required an active choice that he was not interested in making. He walked through the building and asked questions that indicated he was actually listening to the answers, and when he looked at the foundation crack on the north wall, he got down on his hands and knees and examined it from several angles before he stood up and gave her a number. The number was lower than the figure Charlotte had quoted from the previous failed claimant's account by nearly $5,000. The roof needed work but not replacement. Electrical from scratch. Plumbing from the street connection. She could do it inside the money from the vault. She hired him. Jasper Wren came on a Monday morning, crossing the backfield on foot, with the unhurried pace of a man of 84 who has decided that walking is something he is going to keep doing, regardless of what various parts of him have to say about it. He was a Korean War veteran who had lived 2 miles east of the post office since before Agnes Whitfield became postmaster, and he had known Howard Whitfield and had watched Agnes run the building for 23 years and had watched it sit empty for 37 years more from across those 2 miles, with a patience that was not indifference, but something more like faith. He knocked at the back door. Eliza opened it. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of someone who has spent a long lifetime quickly determining whether a person is going to be all right. He held up a carton of eggs. "From my hens," he said, "not those store ones." She took the eggs and let him in. He walked through the building slowly, touching things, looking at things, making the quiet, specific observations of someone who had been paying close attention to a place for a very long time. He told her about the spring under the property, still potentially active, worth checking before the plumbing work began. He told her about a storage cellar filled in during the 1940s renovation, whose location he could identify from the pattern of settled ground in the backfield. He told her about the Whitfield family and Howard and Agnes and what the building had meant to the county during the Depression and the war years. He came back twice a week after that. He brought eggs and information and occasionally labor, because Jasper Wren at 84 could still do certain things on a construction site more efficiently than men 40 years younger, and he did them without comment. Bet Cruz arrived the following Saturday. She was 68, a widow running the hardware store on Main Street alone. since her husband died 6 years before, with the kind of forward-moving energy that certain widows develop when they discover that grief, while entirely real, does not excuse the gutters or the inventory. She brought a casserole and walked through the lobby with the eye of someone assessing rather than admiring, though what she found clearly met the standard. She stopped at the brass mailboxes. The boxes, she said. They're staying, Eliza said. Betty nodded once, the nod of someone reaching a settled conclusion. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, always with something useful, a tool from the hardware stock she had recognized as applicable to the renovation, a contact for a contractor in the county who charged honest rates, a piece of the building's history she had found in her late husband's papers from his time on the town council. She became, without any formal arrangement, part of the structure of the project. By late June, the community was gathering around the building in the way that small communities gather around something when they sense that something worth preserving is being preserved. Vera Sims brought food regularly and recruited others to bring food. Charlotte brought historical materials from the county archive and spent Saturday afternoons helping Eliza research the names on the mail sack envelopes. Pastor Aldous Fenn, from the Methodist Church 3 blocks over, stopped in one afternoon with a genuine rather than professional interest in what was happening, and the congregation he mentioned had access to several databases that turned out to be useful for tracing people who had moved from Kellerton in the 1970s. The renovation proceeded with the momentum of people who have a clear reason for the work. Reed rebuilt the North Foundation section with a precision that Jasper observed and approved in a single sentence. The roof was patched and treated. The electrical was run from a new panel. Plumbing went in from the street, and the lobby floor, cleaned through 6 weeks of patient work, came up to something that stopped people when they first saw it: the black and white octagons of Ezekiel Whitfield's 1908 order emerging from beneath the grime of decades, like something that had been waiting for exactly this. Holloway came back in late June. He brought an engineer with a clipboard who spent the better part of a morning on the public sidewalk taking photographs and measurements. Holloway stood to one side and watched and said when Eliza came out he had been in touch with the county about her permit status. There were some questions about the curing specifications on the foundation repair work. It would be unfortunate if those questions affected her 18-month clock. She said nothing. She watched the engineer finish his documentation. She went back inside and called Patricia Howe. Patricia said, "Noted. Keep your own documentation current. He is looking for a procedural mechanism, and we are going to make sure he doesn't find one." 3 days later, a code enforcement citation appeared on the front door, a county notice regarding the building's residential occupancy status, the zoning classification for the parcel, the absence of a certificate of occupancy for habitation. 30 days to comply or vacate. Eliza photographed it, sent the photo to Patricia, and Charlotte noted the date in her file and went back to work. She had 17 months of her 18-month window remaining. She intended to use them. It was Jasper who noticed the wall. He was in the back storage room one afternoon watching Reed work on the interior framing when he stopped and put his palm flat against a section of the north wall about 6 feet from the corner. His hand stayed there. He rapped his knuckles against it and then against the adjacent sections and listened to the difference. "This doesn't match," he said. Reed came over. He tapped the wall at several points in a methodical pattern, listening. The indicated section had a slightly different acoustic quality from the brick on either side, not quite hollow, but not the same solid resonance. "Could be a utility chase," Reed said. "Could be," Jasper said without moving his hand. Eliza was in the doorway. She came in and looked at the section. She looked at the mortar joints, which were subtly different from those on either side, weathered differently, a slightly different composition. Someone had opened this wall and resealed it carefully enough that 40 years of aging had gone a long way toward disguising the work, but not far enough to fool someone who had been paying attention for 84 years. She told Reed to take it down carefully. It took 2 hours. They removed the bricks one at a time, stacking them in order on the floor. The mortar in the sealed section was older than the rest of the wall, which told Reed the section had been resealed sometime well before the post office closed in 1987, decades before probably. Behind the false section was a chamber, 18 inches deep, 3 feet across, interior surfaces, finished with rough plaster that had kept the contents completely dry for what might have been 80 years. Inside, a wooden box built from fitted planks with a simple wire clasp. Heavy. She carried it to the sorting table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and crumbled at the edges when she peeled it back, was a collection of documents. She handled them at their corners and spread them carefully under the light. The first was a land patent, Department of the Interior, dated April 14, 1908, bearing the name Ezekiel Thomas Whitfield. The property description covered the post office parcel and the 3 adjacent lots on Main Street, set out in the precise technical language of metes and bounds. Below the standard patent language, a handwritten addition in Ezekiel's own hand. The mineral rights below this patent shall pass with the land and shall not be separated from it under any future transaction in perpetuity. The second document was a deed, Ezekiel's handwriting again, conveying the full parcel, including all surface and subsurface rights to the community of Kellerton, Iowa. At the bottom below the mineral rights clause that also appeared in the county archive, copy a further handwritten note not present in the county copy. These rights are inalienable from this conveyance. No subsequent owner or administrator may sever them. They are one with the land and with the people of Kellerton. The third document was on county letterhead, dated 1962, a resolution of the Kellerton Town Council, signed by 4 members in their formal capacity, confirming the 1908 conveyance and its terms, and adding that any mineral or subsurface resource discovered beneath this parcel at any future date shall produce revenue administered by the community of Kellerton, Iowa, in perpetuity as specified in the original conveyance of Ezekiel Thomas Whitfield. Charlotte Briggs came to the building within 20 minutes of Eliza's call and read the documents on the sorting table with the steady, rapid attention of someone who is confirming something she had suspected was there to be confirmed. He found this 1962 resolution in the archive, Charlotte said. His people did. They would have found the 1908 deed and looked for anything supplementary, and they found this. And they understood that if anyone ever claimed this building successfully and found these documents and understood them, their strategy collapsed entirely. She looked at Eliza. "We're calling Patricia Howe," she said. Patricia reviewed the photographs that evening and called back the next morning. The documents were valid, operative, and had not been superseded. Taken together with the 1908 deed already in the county archive, they constituted an unambiguous legal basis for the community of Kellerton to hold the property and all mineral rights beneath it in perpetuity. The GSA classification was correctable by county action. She recommended they file for that correction immediately and schedule a county commissioner's hearing on formal recognition of the community title. Charlotte scheduled it for the second week of August. In the weeks between the document discovery and the hearing, Eliza worked on the letters. She spent her evenings at the sorting table going through the canvas sacks with the methodical care of someone who understands that what they are handling is not paper. She sorted by decade and then by geography and then by legibility, creating a priority list of names and addresses that offered the best chance of being traced. She drove to Burlington twice a week to use the historical databases at the library. She wrote to county clerks in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Kansas. She called phone numbers she found through genealogical databases and introduced herself to strangers and explained that she had a letter for them or for someone they were descended from that had been sitting in a vault in Iowa for between 30 and 40 years. Most people were cautious at first. A few hung up, but most listened, and when they understood what she was describing, the caution became something else. Marion Sorrell was 74 years old and lived in Cedar Rapids. She had grown up in Kellerton in the 1960s and early 1970s and had left for college and never come back to stay. When Eliza called and told her she had a letter from Kellerton, postmarked 1984, the silence on the line lasted long enough that Eliza said hello twice. Then Marion said, in a voice working hard to stay even, who sent it. Eliza read her the return address. Marion made a sound that was not quite a word. Her mother had died in 1989. She had sent Marion birthday cards every year from the time Marion left Kellerton, and Marion had received most of them, but there had been one year, her 35th birthday, when the card had not arrived, and she had thought, in the way that grown children of good mothers sometimes think such things, that perhaps her mother had simply forgotten. She had never asked. She had never said anything about it, but she had thought it. I didn't open it, Eliza said. It's still sealed. I wanted to ask you first. Read it to me, Marion said. Eliza opened the envelope carefully along the top and took out the birthday card, the kind with flowers on the front and a printed verse inside. And beneath the printed verse, in the careful, slightly arthritic handwriting of a woman who had spent her life expressing herself, precisely several lines of specific, particular love, the kind a mother writes to a daughter when she is trying to put into words what she has always assumed the daughter already knew, but is no longer willing to leave only assumed. Eliza read it. It took 2 minutes. Marion was quiet for a long time. She thought, I forgot, Marion finally said. Or maybe she thought I didn't care enough to say anything. She didn't forget, Eliza said. And she knew you cared. No, Marion said softly. I know that now. She drove to Kellerton the following Saturday, and Eliza gave her the original card, and they sat in the lobby together for a while, and Marion looked at the brass boxes and the tile floor and the tin ceiling and asked about what the building was becoming. And Eliza told her, and Marion said, this is a good use for a place that already knew how to hold things. Harold Fenwick was 67 and lived in Wisconsin. He was a retired high school principal who had been raised in the kind of family where important things were demonstrated rather than spoken, where love showed up in the showing up and the doing, and where the words that described the love lived mostly in a space between people that was understood without language. His father had died in April of 1984. Harold had been with him at the end. He had believed, because of how well he had known his father, that he understood everything his father had wanted to say to him. He had no reason to think otherwise. Eliza called him on a November afternoon. She told him she had a letter his father had written the week before his death, addressed to Harold's apartment in Milwaukee, which he had moved away from the following summer. The letter had come back undeliverable to Kellerton, which was where Harold's father had mailed it, visiting a cousin that week. Harold was silent for a while. Then, would you read it to me? Eliza opened the envelope and read the letter. It took 4 minutes. It was not a long letter. Harold's father had not been a long letter writer, but it was a complete one, and what it said was specific and exact, and went directly to the things Harold had assumed his father had felt, but had never heard him say in those words. Harold was quiet for much longer this time. 40 years, he said. I've been carrying 40 years of not knowing he thought any of that. Eliza listened to his breathing on the other end of the line and waited. He did think it, she said. He wrote it down so you would know. She sent him the original by registered mail the next morning with a note that said, your father wrote as clearly as he thought, and he thought clearly of you. The second mail sack was from the 1970s, and she was working through it on a Wednesday evening in late October when she found the envelope from Margaret Calloway. She set it down and picked it up again and read the return address twice. Margaret Calloway, Kellerton, Iowa, 1979. The destination was an Omaha address on the west side of the city. The recipient was William Calloway. Calloway had been Nora's name before she married Thomas Marsh. Nora had grown up in Omaha. Nora had never in any conversation Eliza could remember mentioned a town called Kellerton or any member of her family who had lived in Iowa. But someone named Margaret Calloway had mailed a letter from this building in 1979 to an Omaha address to someone with her mother's family name. William Calloway would have been Nora's uncle or her father or someone of that generation. If Margaret was Nora's grandmother, she would have been in her 60s in 1979 living in Kellerton trying to reach someone in Omaha who had left without leaving a forwarding address that Kellerton's post office could follow. Eliza held the envelope for a long time. She thought about the bus, about the $18 and the diner and the way she had not been able to stop looking at the building through the window. She thought about what it meant to end up somewhere you had not planned to go and to find your own family name in a vault inside a letter that had never arrived, and to have no way of verifying whether these things were connected by something deeper than coincidence or whether some things simply happened the way they happened, and the meaning you found in them was the meaning you brought. She did not know. She was not sure the question had an answer or that the answer would change anything that mattered. She held the envelope for a long time. Then she opened it. Inside was one page handwritten in an upright, careful script, ink faded to a soft blue-gray that was still entirely legible. "Dear William," it began, "I know we have not spoken in several years, and I know the responsibility for that silence is more mine than yours. I am writing because I have reached an age at which leaving important things unsaid no longer seems like an option I am entitled to." Margaret Calloway had written to her son, who had left Kellerton in the early 1970s, who had married and built a life in Omaha, who had children she had never met and who had not come home. She wrote about why he had left, which she understood better now than she had at the time, and about the pride that had kept her from writing sooner, and how she had come to see that kind of pride as a form of cowardice that cost more than it preserved. At the bottom she wrote, "I would very much like to know my grandchildren. Before I am no longer in any position to do so. I am not asking you to forget what happened. I am only asking you to let me try to do better than I did." She signed it, "Your mother, Margaret." William Calloway was her mother's father, Nora's father, and Nora had grown up in Omaha, never mentioning a grandmother in Iowa who had written to her son in 1979 asking to know her grandchildren, which meant either that the letter had not arrived, which it had not, or that a reconciliation had happened through some other channel without Nora ever learning the full story, or that it had not happened at all, and the distance had simply continued. Eliza would not learn which. Too many people were gone who would have known. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had grown up in Omaha, not knowing she had a great-grandmother in Kellerton who had written a letter that was sitting in a vault waiting to be delivered. She thought about what it meant to be connected to a place through channels invisible until someone came along patient enough to follow them. She put Margaret Calloway's letter in her jacket pocket next to Agnes Whitfield's letter. She finished her coffee and went back to work. The diamond ring was identified through an estate jewelry dealer in Burlington named Osborne, a meticulous man who treated everything that came to his bench with the same close attention regardless of its apparent worth. He examined the ring under magnification and told Eliza it was a genuine diamond old cut in a custom setting from the late 1940s or early 1950s. He pointed out the engraving inside the band ca. 1952. Eliza photographed the ring and posted the description in the regional bulletin board, the Kellerton Community Notice Board, in the post office lobby, and 2 genealogical forms that Charlotte had identified as likely to have members with Kellerton family connections. Charlotte called 2 days later. She had found an Ashford family in the county records. A woman named Clara Ashford, initials CA, living in Kellerton. Through the early 1960s, the family had left when Clara's daughter was very young. Edna Ashford called from her home in Illinois 3 days after that. She was 62 with a voice that was measured in the way of someone who has learned to hold certain kinds of hope carefully because hope is expensive when it does not pay out. She told Eliza about the ring. Her mother, Clara, had given it to Edna's father to mail when Clara entered the hospital for the last time in 1988, wanting Edna to have it while she was still alive to know her daughter had received it. Edna's father had mailed it to an address Edna had moved away from the previous year without remembering to tell him. The ring had come back undeliverable to Kellerton into the vault where it had been sitting for 35 years. It's here, Eliza said. It's been in the vault since 1988. It's in good condition. There was a silence on the line. I'll come and get it, Edna said. She drove straight through from Illinois without stopping except for gas, arriving on a Friday morning after 7 hours on the road. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the post office and looked at the building with an expression that contained recognition, as if she had seen it before in a context she was working to place. Inside in the lobby, Eliza gave her the ring in the felt pouch. Edna held it in both hands without putting it on, turning it slowly, looking at the stone and the setting and the inscription inside the band. They stood together in the quiet of the restored room, the brass boxes along the wall and the tile floor and the tin ceiling, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing was required. After a while, Edna looked around the room. Something in her expression had become more complicated. My mother grew up here, she said. I thought she might have. Eliza said, I found a letter in the second sack with the name Ashford on the return address. I set it aside for you to decide about. Edna looked at the letter when Eliza retrieved it, a 1983 envelope with Clara Ashford's name above a Kellerton address. She opened it slowly and read it quietly and then set it face down on the sorting table. There's something you should know, she said. My mother was involved with someone here before she married my father. It ended badly. She never talked about it directly, but after she died, I went through her papers and I found letters. The return address on those letters was the name Holloway. Eliza was very still. Craig Holloway's family, she said. His grandfather, Edna said. Raymond Holloway. My mother was engaged to him in the early 1950s. Something happened and it ended, and she left Kellerton and never came back. Raymond married someone else and stayed. His son grew up here and left. Craig Holloway is the grandson. The ring, Eliza said. Raymond gave it to my mother when they were engaged. Edna confirmed. She kept it her whole life and wanted me to have it when she was dying. She looked at the ring in the felt pouch. Craig would have known about this ring if his family ever talked about Raymond's history. He would have recognized the initials and the year if he had ever gotten into that strongbox. Eliza thought about Craig Holloway offering $40,000 within hours of her signing the papers. She thought about the broken padlock that had been put back in the box. She thought about the engineer with the clipboard and the occupancy citation. She thought about a lot of things in rapid succession. I don't think he ever got in, she said. I think he was watching the building to make sure no one else did, and he was planning to acquire it through the county. But the strongbox padlock was cut by Dennis Kolb in 2011. Holloway was the one who made Kolb run. He must have known what was in the third strongbox, or suspected, and that was part of why he needed to control who found it. Edna looked at her, a complicated woman reading a complicated situation. What are you going to do with all of this, she said. I'm going to talk to the county commissioners about the community deed, Eliza said, and then I'm going to open the letter room. Edna Ashford drove back to Illinois with her mother's ring and her mother's letter from 1983, and she called back 2 weeks later to offer her own account of her family's Kellerton history to the community archive that Charlotte was beginning to build, which Eliza accepted. The county commissioner's hearing was on the second Tuesday of August. Patricia Howe presented the legal analysis. Charlotte Briggs provided the historical documentation from the county archive. Eliza sat in the third row and watched the 5 commissioners read through 31 pages of documents with the careful thoroughness of people who understand they are making a decision that will be discussed in this county for a long time. The resolution passed 4-1. The post office parcel, including the 3 adjacent lots and all mineral rights to 1,000 feet, was formally recognized as community property held under the terms of Ezekiel Whitfield's 1908 deed, continuously operative and never superseded. The Kellerton Community Trust was established to administer the property. Charlotte Briggs was elected chair. Eliza was elected to the board by a unanimous vote of the commissioners and the community members present. In the parking lot afterward, Craig Holloway was waiting by his car. He had attended the hearing without speaking during public comment, which Eliza had registered. He was alone. He looked at her when she came out with the look of a man at the end of a strategy he had run for a long time, accounting for where he had arrived versus where he had planned to be. "My attorney called this afternoon," he said. "So did mine," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the county building behind her, and then at nothing in particular, and then at her. "My grandfather was from this town," he said. "He talked about it sometimes. There was something here he had wanted a long time ago, something he never got. I think I understood that story in a way that made me feel like acquiring the building was a way of settling something that had gone unsettled for too long." He stopped. "I went about it the wrong way," he said. The words were an accounting rather than an apology, but they were something. "Yes," Eliza said, "you did." He nodded once, minimal and acknowledging, and got into his car and drove out of the parking lot at a measured speed. She watched him go. She thought about Raymond Holloway and Clara Ashford, and about the ring that had sat in a vault for 35 years, and about what it costs a person to inherit a grief and then pursue it badly in the wrong direction. She went back inside to call Patricia Howe. The mineral rights that the 1908 deed had preserved for the community of Kellerton became the subject of a negotiation that took 4 months. A company that was not Holloway Land Partners and that had no apparent connection to Holloway approached the Community Trust in October through Patricia Howe's office with a straightforward revenue-sharing proposal for the silica deposit. The terms were honest. Patricia reviewed them for 3 weeks and reported them to the trust board as the best terms she had seen for this type of arrangement in her 20 years of practice. The trust voted to accept. For the first time in a generation, Kellerton, Iowa, had a financial future that did not depend on outside rescue or continued decline. It would not save the town. Nothing saves a dying town all at once, but it gave the town something. It had not had the possibility of a different conversation about what came next. Jasper Wren, when Charlotte read him the revenue projections at the November board meeting, sat down slowly in the chair that had been placed for him and was quiet for a long minute. Ezekiel Whitfield, he said, finally would be very satisfied. Eliza thought that was probably accurate. Agnes Whitfield was found through a social worker named Donna Reeves at the County Aging Services office in Burlington. Donna called on a Monday morning in mid-October, having read the regional newspaper's account of the letter room project and its backstory, and said, without preamble, "I think I know who wrote the letter you found in that vault. Agnes Whitfield," she said. "She is a resident at Maple Ridge Care Center here in Burlington. She is 96 years old in March. On her good days, she is entirely lucid, and her memory is frankly remarkable. She has mentioned the Kellerton post office in conversation many times over the years. I thought she was reminiscing about her career. I understand now that she was doing something else. Eliza drove to Burlington the following morning. The sky was the particular gray of a late fall day in Iowa, low and flat and honest, with no distance between what the weather was and what it looked like. The fields on either side of the highway had been harvested to stubble the corn stalks, cut and the ground open and waiting for winter, and the road ran arrow straight ahead of her, the way Iowa roads do, as if they were designed by people who believed the most honest way to get somewhere was directly. Maple Ridge was a low building at the edge of Burlington, carefully maintained with a parking lot and several bare-limbed trees and a small garden whose structure was still visible under the November frosts, the lines of dormant perennials and the edged borders that would come back in spring. A nursing assistant led her to a room at the end of the east corridor and knocked lightly on the open door. Agnes Whitfield was sitting in a chair by the window. She was small and contained with the posture of someone whose body remembered decades of purposeful physical work, even when the work itself was gone. Her hair was white, cut close. Her hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of hands that have been busy for nearly a century and have recently been given a different kind of work, which is the work of being still and watching. She looked at Eliza when she appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were dark and very clear, and she looked for a long moment in the manner of someone receiving information through multiple channels at once. "You found it," she said. Not a question, a recognition. "Yes," Eliza said, "I found it." Agnes looked at her for another moment, and then at the window, and something in her face settled, a long-held thing releasing at last. "How long?" she asked. 37 years since you closed the building. 14 months since I opened it." Agnes turned back to look at Eliza. "Sit down," she said. Eliza pulled the chair from beside the writing desk and sat across from her. 211 letters delivered, Eliza said. 89 in archival storage in the vault still waiting. The money orders were all cashed. The cash went into the renovation fund. The jewelry has been returned to the families where I could find them. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were wet at their edges, but her voice when she spoke was entirely steady. 211, she said. I did not dare hope for numbers like that. Some of those letters had been in the sacks since the early 1970s. Some took months to trace, Eliza said, but they were worth finding. Agnes looked at her hands. She turned them over slowly, examining the palms, the map of a working life visible in them. I left the door unlocked, she said, because I could not bring myself to lock it. I had spent 23 years understanding what that building was for. The lock felt like a denial of everything I believed it meant. She paused. I thought about it many times afterward, whether the right person would find it, whether they would understand what I had left and why, whether they would read the letter and believe that it was meant in the way it was meant, not as a bequest, but as a trust passed from one person to another across a distance of time. I believed it, Eliza said. From the first reading, Agnes looked at her with the steady, complete attention that she had given to everything for 96 years. How did you find the building, she asked. Eliza told her. The bus from Omaha, the $18, Vera Sims, and the pie. Looking out the diner window and not being able to stop looking. Walking 3 blocks to the county office and signing a form for a building that 2 previous people had walked away from. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Eliza finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My grandfather built that building for the community and trusted that the documents he left behind would say what they needed to say when the moment came. He died before he knew whether they would. She paused. I left a letter in an unlocked vault and trusted that the right person would come. I had 37 years to wonder whether I had been right to trust that. You were right, Eliza said. Agnes looked out the window at the bare trees in the garden. A crow landed in the nearest one and sat there with the composed self-possession of a bird that has found a good position and is not in any hurry to leave it. Tell me what you've done with the building, Agnes said. Eliza told her. The tile floor cleaned and restored, the tin ceiling its original surface recovered through 6 weeks of careful work. The brass boxes all in place, all windows intact. The sorting tables kept in the back room, the vault with its shelves and archival boxes, and the letters still waiting for someone to claim them. The community trusts and the mineral rights, and what had happened with Craig Holloway. She told her about Margaret Calloway's letter and what it meant. Agnes listened to all of it. When Eliza was done, Agnes said, "Your great-grandmother sent a letter from my building in 1979, and the letter brought you back to the building 45 years later." She considered this for a moment. There are people who would say that is coincidence. I am 96 years old, and I have had a long time to form an opinion about coincidence. What is your opinion? Eliza asked. That some things look like coincidence from the outside and look like something else from the inside, Agnes said, and that the difference between the two views is whether you were paying the right kind of attention. She reached out and put her hand over Eliza's, which were resting on Eliza's knees. Her grip was warmer and firmer than expected, the grip of someone who had been holding things with intention for nearly a century and had not stopped. You came back for it, she said. I did not know your name or your face or your family. I only knew that someone would come. I just did not know it would take this long. I didn't know I was coming, Eliza said. No, Agnes said. The ones who are meant to find things rarely do. That is what makes the finding mean something. They sat together in the quiet room while the November light came through the window at its low angle, clear and cold, and the crow considered its options in the bare tree outside and eventually lifted into the gray sky and was gone. Before she left, Eliza set on the table beside Agnes's chair a photograph she had printed that morning, the post office lobby as it was now, the tile floor in the morning light, the brass boxes along the wall, the tin ceiling, the clean windows admitting the full sky. Agnes picked it up and held it at the angle that requires close and tilted and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She looked at the boxes. All of them, Eliza said. Every one. Original in place, every number plate legible. Agnes lowered the photograph to her lap and kept her hand flat on it. She did not say anything. The expression on her face was the specific expression of a person who has held a faith for a very long time and is now receiving quietly and without drama the confirmation that the faith was warranted. It was not a loud expression. It was the kind that goes deep. Eliza drove back to Kellerton in the late afternoon along the same 2-lane road, the sun going down behind her and to the west, and the fields on either side turning from brown to gold to the dark specific color they became in the last light before dark. She drove through the flat, honest geography of central Iowa and thought about Agnes Whitfield sitting in a chair by a window with a photograph on her lap, and about Ezekiel Whitfield filing a deed with a county recorder in 1908 and going home to tell his wife what he had done, and about the particular patience of people who trust that the right thing done correctly will eventually reach the person it was meant for. It just takes time, sometimes a great deal of it. Bert Callister came to Kellerton on the Saturday of the letter room's first public opening. He drove from Omaha in his dark green pickup, 200,000 miles on it, a replaced side mirror that had never quite matched the original, and he parked in front of the building and sat behind the wheel for a moment before he got out, looking at the facade, taking it in completely before he moved. Eliza saw him through the front window. She went out. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the building with the expression of a man adjusting what he had expected to see against what was actually in front of him, and what was in front of him was more than he had expected. The clean brick, the straightened flagpole with a flag, the repointed steps, the small evergreens in pots on either side of the door that Betsy Krause had brought without being asked, and that turned out to be exactly what the entrance needed. He shook his head once slowly, which was the opposite of what head shaking usually means. "Tom," he said, and then he stopped. He started again. Tom would have looked at the front left corner of the steps. "Reed redid it," she said. Someone pointed out the mortar mix was slightly off. He looked at her. He had known Thomas Marsh for 30 years, and Thomas Marsh's daughter for 23, and what was in his face when he looked at her was something he would not put into words, being a man who did not put things into words if the situation could communicate them another way. "Come inside," she said. He walked through the building the way certain people walk through places they have been told about, but are finally seeing, calibrating what they heard against what they are standing in. He walked slowly. He looked at the brass boxes and touched the face of one with his thumb. He looked up at the tin ceiling without saying anything. He walked through the gate in the brass grill and stood in the back room and looked at the sorting tables and the pegs on the wall, and then he looked at the vault. The door open as it always was, as it had always been since Agnes Whitfield had walked out of this building on a June evening in 1987 and left it open for whoever came next. He stood at the vault door and looked at the shelves inside, the archival boxes with their careful labels, the ledgers, the Ezekiel Whitfield postal seal on its dedicated shelf, bronze, substantial, still clean from the 1908 casting. "What's in the boxes?" he said. 89 letters, she said. "The ones I couldn't find the right people for." "They're waiting." "For what?" "For whoever's looking for them," she said. "There's usually someone. They just don't always know that's what they're looking for until they find it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned from the vault and looked at her with the direct simplicity that was the core of who he was. "Tom would have been proud of you," he said. He stopped. "Let me say that right. He would not have said proud. He would have looked at this, and he would have nodded, and he would not have said anything, and you would have known." She paused. "I know you know what that nod would have looked like." She knew. She looked at the vault and the shelves and the boxes and the open door that had been open for 37 years, waiting for her to come through it. She thought about Thomas Marsh, who had listened to engines and carried a desert home from the Gulf, and had taught her that the right way to do something was the only standard worth applying. She thought about Nora Marsh née Calloway, whose grandmother had sent a letter from this building in 1979 that had waited 45 years to be received. She thought about Agnes Whitfield at 96, in a chair by a window 40 miles away, her hand on a photograph of this lobby. She thought about Ezekiel Whitfield, who had built this building in 1908 and signed a deed that said it belonged to the community, and who had understood that some things need to be protected in writing because the world is full of people with reasons to disagree. She thought about the 89 letters in the archival boxes, waiting, the way certain things wait, not passively, but with a kind of active readiness available to whoever comes along with the patience to ask the right questions. Outside on Main Street, it was a Saturday in October, and there were more cars parked along the curb than Eliza had counted on any single day since she had arrived in Kellerton. People were going into the diner, people were going into the hardware store, people were coming to the letter room, stepping through the front door with the careful respect of people entering somewhere that has acquired its dignity through actual history rather than decoration. And they were looking at the tile floor and the tin ceiling and the brass boxes, and some of them were sitting in the chairs along the wall and being still for a while, which is something people rarely give themselves permission to do and which they visibly needed. Kellerton, Iowa had 304 people, and a grain elevator at the end of Main Street, and a diner and a barber shop and a hardware store, and a new revenue stream from a mineral rights agreement that would not save the town all at once, but would change the conversation about what saving might mean. It had a community trust and a community board and a county archive being actively expanded with the histories of families that had been here and left and were beginning to come back in some form. And on the corner of the Main and Elm, it had the letter room, which was open on Saturdays, and which was full of people on this particular Saturday in October who had driven from various distances to be somewhere that took the fact of their family's connections to this place seriously. Not all dying towns get that. Most of them don't. Most of them get smaller and quieter until the last few people left find somewhere else to be, and the buildings stand empty and the land waits for someone to come and find a new use for it. Some towns, a few, find something inside them that the dying had not yet reached, some small particular thing that was there all along, put there by someone who understood that certain things need to be protected in ways that outlast the person doing the protecting. Kellerton had Ezekiel Whitfield's deed. It had Agnes Whitfield's unlocked vault. It had the letters in the archival boxes and the people who had come to find them. It had Jasper Wren, who knew where the old spring was and had been paying attention to this property for more than 60 years. It had Betty Cruse and her hardware store and her practical love of things built to last. It had Charlotte Briggs, who had known there was something in those county records and had pulled the folder and read it carefully when it mattered. And it had Eliza Marsh, who was 23 years old and had arrived with $18 and a dead father's tools and had spent 14 months learning that some things which look like accidents turn out on close examination to have been a long time coming. The renovation passed its final inspection in November 1 month before the 18-month deadline. The inspector, a county official named Gardner, who had been doing code inspections for 20 years, walked through every room with the thorough attention of someone who has been around long enough to not be fooled by surfaces. And at the end, he stood in the lobby and looked at the tile and the ceiling and the brass boxes and said, "This is the best work I've seen done on a historic building in this county in 15 years. He said it in the tone of a man who does not give compliments as a habit, which meant the compliment was accurate. Reed Galloway received this information by text from Eliza while he was eating lunch at the diner. He read it and put his phone down and finished his soup and said nothing to anyone, which was his way, the same way he had worked on the building for 14 months, steady and skilled, and without requiring the work to be about anything other than what it was. Eliza stood outside the post office in the November afternoon light and looked at the building. The inspection certificate meant the building was hers, not provisionally, not subject to review, hers and the community's in the way that Ezekiel Whitfield had intended in 1908 and that Agnes Whitfield had protected in 1987 by leaving a door unlocked and trusting that the right person would eventually push it open. She thought about her father's dog tags in her jacket pocket, which she carried every day. She thought about the tool roll on the shelf inside the 6 tools in their 6 pockets, the leather worn dark from Thomas's hands and from hers. She thought about what it meant to hold something that had been earned rather than simply received. Not just the building, though. The building was real and solid and standing 30 feet in front of her in the November afternoon, but the letters in the archival boxes and the 211 that had found their way to the people they were meant for, and the phone calls and the long evenings at the sorting table and the drives to Burlington and the 6 months of going through 3 canvas sacks, 1 envelope at a time. She thought about Marion Sorrell in Cedar Rapids holding a birthday card from 1984 against her chest. Harold Fenwick in Wisconsin, who had thought he knew everything his father had wanted him to know, and had learned at 67 that there was one more thing the elderly man at the service counter, running his thumb along the wood, the child with her face pressed against the mailbox glass, and Agnes Whitfield at 96 with a photograph of this lobby on her lap and her hand flat on it. That is the thing about a letter that never arrived. It is not lost. It is waiting for someone patient enough to pick up each envelope and ask who was this meant for, and is that person still reachable, and if not, who would have wanted to know what it said. The Kellerton post office had been waiting for Eliza Marsh for 37 years without knowing her name. It had been waiting since the June evening when Agnes Whitfield walked out the front door and left the vault unlocked and trusted the building with what it held. It had been waiting through 14 years of failed auction attempts and 2 people who claimed it and left, and through the 6 years after that when Craig Holloway was watching it from a distance and making sure no one else could hold it long enough to find what was underneath. It had been waiting for the right person, and the right person had arrived on a broken-down bus with $18 and a dead father's tools on a Wednesday morning in late May in a town she had never heard of. Eliza Marsh was 23 years old. She had $1 and she spent it on an abandoned post office in a dying town in Iowa. It was the best dollar she ever spent,